I want to take you on a bit of a journey this morning, a journey of multiple lessons that I had to learn over the past 5 years in terms of designing effective AI systems, but also in terms of working with product engineers. Although there's been many lessons, I think the one overarching one that ties all of them together is that psychologists and technologists and engineers speak two totally different languages, and they've got two fundamentally different expectations when it comes to designing systems to facilitate well-being. And this expectation is not about design choices. It's not about word choices or so on. It's an expectation that's so profound that it fundamentally changes how the system works. Whether a system is being built to actually help a person and facilitate their well-being versus one that's actually causing active harm. And that's a journey I want to take you on this morning. So let me take you back three and a half years ago. I was brought in to help design a series of AI agents that could help assess and facilitate well-being of individuals. The main focus was trying to help people who are extremely stressed, a little bit depressed, to be more effective and efficient, kind of like at work. So during one of these sessions, we sat down and the product team was busy talking about some of the things that they already had in place that they've already been trying. So for example, if a person showed high levels of hopelessness, a little bit of stress, and they were kind of like, it triggered a specific learning journey. And this learning journey started off with what they called a comfort card. A little image of a sunset would pop up, some soothing music will be popping up in the background, and a person would gently take you through some mindfulness-based stress reduction meditation exercises. Okay, farewell, interesting. But I asked myself, and the product manager, but if a person is hopeless and they don't have energy and they already feel like they've got nothing left anymore, what happens if that guy's actually suicidal? And the product manager told me something that gave me a little bit of the creeps. And he said, oh, wait. I don't think you know what we're building here. We're not building a clinical tool. We're just wellness, right? We don't do suicide. That's pertinent in our disclaimer and our terms and conditions. Now, at that moment, I kind of realize something, and it means that something that the design team didn't fully grasp is that a user doesn't care about the terms and conditions and doesn't care about liability disclaimers. If a user cries out for help and we hand them a cartoon sunset and a breathing exercise, we didn't just design a feature that didn't work. We basically fundamentally validated their feeling that they are unheard, that they are not good enough, that they can't get through this, that they are alone. Because we have transformed their psychological crisis into a systems failure that the user internalizes as a personal failure. And at that moment, I thought to myself, I wasn't there to help advise them on strategies to improve the system to enhance employees' well-being. I realized I was watching psychological harm being shipped under the banner of wellness. Because my friends, if you promise someone that you're going to help them and you deliver abandonment, something that doesn't work, you're fundamentally shipping harm. So here's the question that I want us to go through in this keynote. Is if we build systems that assess you, that influences you, that tells you they can help your mind become better, what duty of care do I and my system owe you and these people? Because by the end of the day, I want you to have a minimum set of standards in place, a minimum set of standards that you can insist on when you're sitting around the table designing these systems with engineers and product development teams. You'll have a way to speak to these product development teams in a language that they can understand, in a language that they can actually understand the reasoning why you say the things you say and why it's important. I'll teach you how to speak in risk, governance, evidence, and user protection, because that's fundamentally the language that they understand. So let's kind of just look at kind of the hidden premise and the hidden danger around all of this type of stuff. And I want us to just strip away all of the marketing language and, all of the stuff you kind of heard about these AI apps and how effective they are and etc. Because I really want us to look at and name the thing that's actually happening here. So when a system asks a person how they're feeling or assesses something about them and interprets that answer to help figure out what content to provide to them or to make predictions about their well-being or whatever, right? That is a psychological assessment. It classifies human behavior. Right? Secondly, when a system uses a LLM to kind of like help reframe a user's negative thoughts in a positive way, or to deliver personalized coaching or nudge their behavior towards a certain goal, right? That is an intervention, right? In our field, both of these things are protected acts. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in, the definitions of what constitutes psychology and the scope of practice of a psychologist are usually controlled. They're controlled acts. And fundamentally, it has to do with two things covering, protected around assessments and interventions, right? So whatever you do to assess a person's emotional, psychological, social, cognitive kind of like capability, and anything that you do that you implement to change the way in which a person thinks, feels, functions, behaves, or behaves, that's an intervention, and both of those things are classified as psychological acts. And psychological acts are regulated and protected. And many regulations around the world does that. The Health Professions Act in South Africa, the HCPC Act in the UK, and so on. They all have very clear boundaries about what constitutes these psychological acts. And why are they classified? Because if you engage in them and you're not trained, you can cause harm. Because all of these psychological acts require significant amount of training, supervised practice, and clear ethical guidelines. But in the tech sector, this is not the case. In the tech sector, all they care about is engagement features and personalization. But yet it's still psychological acts, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? If you slap a label of therapy on it, or if you're a registered psychologist or not, or if these functions of assessing and changing people's behavior is built in an app, a bot, or an AI system, right? It doesn't matter if the intent is really just to help people or not. It all fundamentally stays a psychological act, and psychological acts are protected for a reason. This matters because design teams often treat psychology, right, as secondary, as an optional extra, unless it actively has the label of therapy on it. And that distinction is psychologically meaningless, right? The code doesn't know it's a therapist. And you know what? Often the user engaging in these systems also don't know, right? Because it's important for us to know that when you engage in a psychological act, you are fundamentally affecting a user's behavior. So I think a system performs a psychological act when it assesses a person's psychological status or functioning, think, feel, function, or behave, right? Or it implements some type of intervention that's intended to change the way in which a person thinks, their emotions, how they behave, or how they function. And that includes doing it through prompts, personalization metrics, predictions, feedback loops, or whatever, right? Fundamentally, if a system assesses you and changes your behavior, it's engaging in a psychological act. And therefore, it requires strict standards in order to be able to manage. So I think the ethical line here is very simple. It doesn't matter what you intend to do. If you engage in these psychological acts, right, you have a duty of care. The intent behind it doesn't remove that duty of care. If you touch anything about human functioning, you inherit responsibilities around being competent, measurement integrity, managing harm, and escalating things or referring things if things get too worse. You inherit that responsibility. If your product measures a person's mind and changes behavior, it owes you that duty of care, regardless of what your legal team calls it. If you want a way to frame this in a way that your product engineers and counterparts will actually accept and understand, right? Frame it around the idea that you're assisting with designing psychologically safe products or psychological product safety guidelines, right? I think this is the idea that products performing psychological acts must meet a minimum amount of standards for claims, measurement, monitoring, and user protection, right? And legislation and governance supports this. So that's how you should frame it. Because you cannot claim something an app is going to provide you with some form of psychological benefit without accepting some form of psychological responsibility. And the law is catching up on our ethics. So let me just say this again to make this very clear. If you claim something has psychological benefit, you inherit psychological responsibility. So with our duty kind of like established, right? Let's kind of like look at how harm actually occurs within these systems so you can get a better idea. So before I kind of like start, it's important to ensure that the teams you are supporting understands the consequences of the things that they're actually building. Because what I've kind of like seen is that they try to design excellent kind of like products and services, but it's not built on anything, and therefore it has fundamentally the potential to kind of like cause harm because there's no theoretical base under it. There's no empirical model. They don't really know what they're doing or why they're doing it, but it looks fancy, right? So we have to find a way to frame it to them in a way in which they understand. But doing so in this way always gathers some resistance because it feels to them like you're basically telling them that they're wrong. And they don't like that, of course. I don't. So I kind of like learned different ways to kind of like approach it and present it to a way in them that it actually makes sense and a way that they actually use to build systems and safeguards into their system. So basically the first thing that I kind of like figured out was the whole idea around claims. I basically tried to translate and say it's important to remember that the marketing language that we use, how we sell it, how we onboard users, and the UI copy that we present to them creates expectations with our users. If you say to someone, oh, this is going to provide you with personalized burnout support, or this is science-backed relief for depression, that creates an expectation that I'm going to get help. These claims determine who selects the products, who buys into the features. And it's usually people that's exceptionally vulnerable because you present people with a burnout or a depression relief system. It's usually people that are burned out or depressed that actually wants to engage in these types of things, right? So you have to be very clear with regards to the claims that you make. Second, let's get to this point about selection again. It's important when a user registers, the intent that you think your system does and what they think is two totally fundamentally different things, because users infer or assume the mechanisms that kind of underline the platforms and the scope of the care that they will provide, that they will be provided with. They decide what the product is supposed to do for them, not you. And that's based on how you communicate it, how you sold it to them. Because a burnout user reads personalized burnout support as the system will understand why I'm going through the things, what I feel, and will able to actually help me to change it. Even if that's not intended, that's what they hear. The third step is this whole idea around mismatch, right? Mechanism mismatch. Because many features that wellbeing platforms have and being built on are very psychologically thin, right? Like it creates like ways to kind of nudge information to you, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's based on a treatment model, right? It provides you with a mood tracker to kind of like track your emotions over time, but that doesn't help you identify the actual kind of like problem. Because usually there is no empirical base or theoretical model that underpins the reason for these interventions that they provide to their users, right? And kind of like when this mismatch occurs, when you present something, when a user has an expectation, you present it with something that doesn't work, right? It does something to them, right? It's not just, oh, it didn't work. Oh, shucks, it didn't work. Oh, we should try something else. No, it creates a deep psychological experience for that user that has real psychological consequences. It makes them feel, oh, I am useless. Even if something that's built to manage this stuff, scientifically proven doesn't help me, I'm beyond help. And just think about that for a moment. So what happens when a person shows no response? Well, the symptoms, of course, persist or they potentially get worse. And the user, of course, the user tries to engage fully with the dynamic system. They do kind of like all of the modules, they do all of the activities. We track basically everything, but nothing changes. But nothing changes in terms of symptoms, but something changes in them. And when something changes in them, that's where the scary part starts. Because then what happens is that they don't attribute the fact that they didn't get better, right, to the system, right? they attribute it to themselves. A depressed or burned out user is already prone to negative attributions and feeling hopeless. So if the system promises personalized kind of like support and interventions and then fails, right, the user may conclude, I'm the kind of person that even a science-backed intervention cannot help. And it's not like I'm promising something and it doesn't work and I stay the same. It makes them feel worse, right? And basically what then happens, the last step is like this whole idea around silence and feedback doesn't come because the users basically just close the app, they uninstall it and they never come back to it again. And they never provide the feedback. The teams can never improve and, improve the functioning of the systems. So they'll keep designing beautiful features that look amazing, right? With no substance, causing more harm in the process. And this is the harm mechanism. The product experience itself becomes an intervention that reinforces their own hopelessness and self-blame. And because the user believes they already tried help before, and this didn't even work, it delays them from getting appropriate help in the future. Because I think, again, the idea that the product experience itself is potentially the thing that causes more psychological harm is something that we need to consider and incorporate into our own frames of reference when we assist these people designing these types of systems. Because this pipeline is why designing psychologically safe products is so important. Because we cannot reduce safety and etc. metric to a metric of averages. We must always be very clear with what we communicate, what we claim, what we measure, and how we escalate things. Because even the fact that we're talking to people, telling them that we are doing something is already creating expectation, and that's already an intervention. So what is kind of like the consequence of this happening, of this failure, right? If a person sees this app, right, it creates an expectation within them. This science-backed thing is going to fix me. That's the expectation that they have. But if the app doesn't work, right, what do? They don't blame the system, they blame themselves. And this is the harm mechanism in action. The product experience is the thing that reinforces this person's negative self-schema, right? And because she already believes that she's already tried therapy or so on, she delays seeking further comeback support. So it causes more harm than good. And I think it's important for us to understand that these things that cause harm happens, but we don't necessarily measure it. And we undermeasure like safety and consequence, both in the academic literature and in practice. And there's, for example, a very nice kind of like systematic literature review that looked at, I think it was from Linderton in 2024, looked at 171 apps that looked at managing depression, anxiety, and etc. But only 55 of that 171 actually reported something with regards to a potential adverse effect. That means our default posture within the industry and academia is not to understand and measure the potential safety consequences of it. It basically has this idea, say, we haven't seen harms, therefore it didn't exist. And that posture and mentality is not correct because that causes harm, right? So within that study, only 32% of these studies actually measured some form of harm, and even that definition of harm was very wide and varied, right? The next part here is that when deterioration does occur when people engage in these systems, they do feel worse if these things don't work, right? But even when these systems and these platforms actually measure it, like it's pooled, it's not zero. So we basically see a rate of around 6-7% on odd a deterioration with these types of systems. So we can't use these ideas that these systems kind of like work as a mechanism of effective safety protocols and stuff being in place, because it's not there, right? Just because I don't measure it doesn't mean that it's not causing harm. So we can kind of like keep in mind that the fact that we can assume that people will potentially get harmed by our systems and start building this in with our systems so that we actually stop actively and passively kind of like monitoring potential harm that's being caused, because users aren't necessarily going to tell us, right? The third thing is like, unlike in the pharmaceutical industry, we have no safeguards in place against like these toxicity markers. In pharma, they've got these mechanisms in place to say, oh, when something actually becomes unhelpful or toxic, and then they can potentially intervene. We do not have those things within psychological apps and platforms. And that is a potential major liability, because if we don't build this stuff in, we're not measuring it. If we can't measure it, we can't actively manage it, and we can't intervene when we see things happening, right? So here's kind of like, I think what makes this all kind of like worse. The standard measures that we kind of like systems use to measure potential harm is not valid or reliable. They use things like engagement metrics in the system to evaluate if something is effective or not. But also, even if we directly ask a person on a scale, right, a symptom scale won't be able to capture that a user now believes that they're unfixable and lost faith in treatment because these interventions didn't work. They spent money on stuff, they wasted months trying to do activities, and nothing kind of like worked. And then they just basically reinforce their negative self-view. There's no scale that can measure that. And we can't potentially assume that if we don't actually ask these users. So the practical point that I kind of want to make here is that product teams rarely implement mechanisms to evaluate deterioration in the psychological sense and the consequences of it. No. They rather focus on measuring engagement, because for them, engagement on the system, how long I spend time on it, is a metric of effectiveness. And that's not the case. So kind of like, so we kind of have to help product teams to build mechanisms in place to detect when a person is actually having negative effects or when they worsen. And we have to figure out ways to route those people to the appropriate levels of support, humans, as an example, and create appropriate escalation pathways. Because only then can we kind of like build safeguards in place that can actually work. Because I think this is what I would like to say, if we build these things, this is kind of like psychological safety product design in action. We have to have the discipline in ourselves to actively define what harms are, figuring out ways that we could potentially measure them actively and passively, and acting when the risk emerge, right? Because that's the way in which we not only facilitate well-being, but we protect our people as we go through. Because I think in digital health and digital health interventions, the absence of reported harm is rarely evidence of psychological safety or safety of the product. It's usually evidence that we're blind to the potential harm that it causes. And that's kind of like the thing I kind of want to leave you with this, is that we have to make sure that we understand what psychological safety is. How do we create psychological safe products, and figuring out ways to actively measure it? Because product teams are using engagement metrics as a mechanism to evaluate effectiveness of their interventions. And that engagement is the actual blind spot itself, right? Because success is not actively defined by how long a person stays on a system or not. Because engagement in system design language is often treated as a UI problem. So if a person doesn't engage with the system, doesn't stay along with it enough, it means, oh, we didn't make the button blue enough, we didn't make it easy to access, etc. But that's not the case when it comes to psychological interventions, right? Because in psychological intervention terms, it's a safety and effectiveness problem, not a UI problem. And that's something that I think most people don't understand. Okay. So the engagement part is an important kind of like metric, but we also have to figure out effective ways in actually how to measure things in an ethical, sustainable, and safe kind of like way. Because bad measurement makes good intentions harmful at scale. Because people build interventions around data, right, and things that they can manage. And I think this is where psychologists can play an active role, because we're trying to understand what validity, reliability, fairness, and etc. kind of like is. Because product analytic teams, I think, are excellent at counting behavior. They're not trained to defend and define effective constructs and figure out how to measure them and how to put them into a model. So, but that's something that we can do. When products claim to assess, I don't know, burnout or depression risk or resilience or well-being or whatever, they implicitly claim that these measures are valid and reliable. And I can tell you that this is not the case. And that poses a number of risks. First, is like the whole idea around construct drift. Because remember, the meaning of a score, for a person changes over time, right? If I measure engagement now, it might be totally different in a year from now, but the meaning of engagement is different. My meaning of burnout changes because I potentially got exposed to what burnout is and isn't. My concept of happiness changes because I understand the different attributing factors to it. So what I measure now or what I measure in 2 months from now with the same measuring instrument, it could potentially be totally different things for that person. So what we measure could potentially drift. Second, the same metric, right? The same thing, the same question doesn't mean the same thing for different populations within in the same subgroup, right? Your anxiety score that you kind of like have measured now with this anxiety measure may potentially systematically like over pathologize you, but may under pathologize or underdiagnose in a different kind of like population group because they might see this thing totally different, right? And we need to figure out ways to assess and detect that. And we can do this statistically through testing, measurement in various and so on. But it's fundamentally important to ensure that we are aware that the same thing doesn't mean the same thing for different people. Next, we have this whole idea around proxy metrics. Systems use proxies for things in order to predict outcomes. So, for example, user engagement on the system is a proxy for effectiveness of the system. That is a metric that they use. But that is mistaken. That is not correct because they mistake engagement in the system with the benefit of the system. So, a reduction in a symptom, right, could potentially be attributed to thousands of different things, not necessarily to your platform. So, and a reduction in reporting decline, for example, in stress today, is interpreted by a system as a reduction in the symptoms itself. And that's also not necessarily the case. So, for example, if a user opens the app 10 times a day, right, the system sees, oh, they're actually getting better because they're using it a lot more. But it could potentially be because they're obsessively checking because they're anxious, right? So there are different fundamental factors that attribute, that causes a person to do certain things. And we have to make sure that what we're measuring is actually the thing that it predicts it is supposed to do, right? Finally, the whole idea about something being popular doesn't necessarily mean it's valid. So, for example, that 16personalities.com, very popular instrument that measures the Myers-Briggs type indicator, kind of like indicators, right? But just because it's super popular doesn't mean it's a valid, reliable kind of like tool. So when we design systems around like assessments, for example, we must insist that every assessment complies to our ideas around measurement integrity. We have to either use validated scales or validated metrics to either assess these types of things. We shouldn't invent a wellness score out of black boxes or black box kind of like ideas, because this is what's happening, right? On the qualitative side, for example, we have to check if we're utilizing an LLM to help summarize and identify and classify a person's story to make, I don't know, drivers of well-being or causes of distress, that model is valid for different population groups, that it's not discriminating against a certain population group because it wasn't trained on data from that population group. So that is a really important thing that we need to take into consideration here, both in the quantitative part, measuring things with instruments, but also the qualitative part, if we're using tools to elicit responses from people to ensure that it's valid, reliable, and fair. We've kind of actually translate this into like a safety metric. I think effective measurement is not just a research kind of like problem, right? It's a runtime problem. You need validated evidence, calibration checks, subgroup monitoring, and making clear how you're going to manage uncertainty for that assessment to actually serve a function within your system. And different legislations and different parts have very clear requirements on what an assessment kind of like needs to be and look like. So, for example, the Health Professions Act says, and how it's implemented in South Africa by the Professional Board of Psychology, it's very clear standards on reliability, validity, and fairness, for example. In an app environment, the APA's app evaluation model, which is like a framework they put on with like 105 criteria that you need to use for effective app design, right? They set very clear criteria on what the clinical foundation is that this stuff needs to be built on, what data practices need to be in place, and what non-optimal, like what non-compliance looks like, what informed consent looks like, etc. So it's very clear with regards to these things. So the tools exist. You just have to find them, ensure the things that you're doing is complying to them. Because I think fundamentally, you cannot manage what you've measured poorly, right? Because psychological claims that you make, something is going to work, requires psychometric evidence. So the next thing I kind of want to talk about is that we have to consider that we have to exert extreme discipline in the claims that we make about the effectiveness of the interventions and things that we're trying to sell. Because design teams often think that showing effectiveness of something is a marketing thing that you slap on at the end to try and sell the product, right? But it's not that. It's something that needs to be fundamentally part of the design of the system. Because for mental health adjacent products and mental health orientated services, the claims you make about something is part of the intervention itself. It already affects the user. If you're saying something is going to help them with burnout, right? It's evidence-based, whatever around it. You're creating expectation that this thing is going to work for them. And that expectation shapes their identity, their interpretation of outcomes. It affects how they think, feel, and function. And it negatively and it can affect, their own view of their own self. So the marketing claims themselves are interventions, and that's something that we need to communicate clearly. So how do we communicate these things in an effective kind of like way? So I think when a product promises something like, oh, we're going to eliminate anxiety forever, that sets a massive unrealistic expectation, and that will fail and that will cause harm. Right? Because when it fails, and again, it inevitably will, the person will crash a lot harder than when they were before. Because the user won't just disengage, they won't just uninstall the app. They'll attribute the failure to themselves because I'm not good enough, because I don't have the energy to do these things. I think the safer fix here is basically to claim things in a realistic kind of like manner. So you build a system of claims with limitations. Create a template that is honest, that protects users, and that translates things to them in a language that they can actually understand. And I think a fundamental shift needs to take place. We have to shift from outcomes, oh, this will make you happy, to a function. Oh, this specific tool helped people that looked kind of like this, and this to help them, and this decreased their levels of stress and anxiety over a 3-month period. This won't just cover you from a legal perspective, right? But it helps you cognitively frame things in a way that protects that user and protects their agency and that manages their expectations. I mean, this kind of like aligns to like all of the other like risk governance frameworks and legislation that we spoke about before and we will speak about again. But it also reduces our legal exposure by reducing like our deceptive marketing around things. Again, remember, the marketing claim is part of the treatment dose, and you have to be bound. You have to bound your claims to actual empirical evidence. So the governance there becomes an absolute important key, because governance turns these principles into enforceable obligations. And there are many forms of governance frameworks and legislation that's in place, right? And ethics teams, product teams always ask me like, oh, can I just get an ethics checklist that I can tick off the box quickly to ensure that I comply? But that's a wrong question. And that mindset is wrong. But because that mindset is the actual thing that gets us into trouble in the first place. Because ethics is not a checklist. It's a way of viewing and approaching the world, right? And we need ways to translate ethics into actions. Now, I think a better question to potentially ask is, or answer to that question, is to say, well, you don't need an ethics checklist. You need a governance standards, something that is auditable. Because governance makes safety repeatable and across people, across teams, and across users, and across releases, right? And there are a few frameworks I think that can potentially use this. And I'll just run through them. And you don't have to be a lawyer to understand them, but just get some idea. The World Health Organization's like guidance on like multimodal kind of like models emphasizes what's important for ethical and safe assessments within the health kind of like sector. So this includes responsibilities that models have a requirement for oversight, responsible deployment. They're very explicit with regards to like the requirements on attention to bias, accountability, and human rights. So it's important to kind of get an idea of that. And that's a framework that you can potentially use to show these designers what's important. The National Institute of Standards and Technologies, Artificial Intelligence kind of like framework, the V1, I think, the new one is currently in place, tries to operationalize like what's required in like four things: govern, what to map, what to measure, and what to manage. And this is usually the things that AI teams, development teams at least understand. So governance talks about like we have to create accountability. Mapping talks about like we have to understand the context and the risks. Measure talks about the instruments we use and the to evaluate impact. And manage talks about like how do we respond to risks in our system. So these are not like abstract ideas, but it translates functional things into actual hard products. And this framework, as you heard, is something that we can speak to easily. So we just have to figure out a way to translate that into a way in which they understand. There's also the NICE framework that talks about like they've got different tiers, and at different tiers they have different requirements. But at tier 3B, they talk about specifically when you measure something, there's specifically requirements for evidence based on risk, on the risk it potentially poses. It requires a certain amount of evidence that need to be produced. You have to show the economic impact of decisions, and you have to ensure that there's active safety monitoring in place. I mentioned the AI API model before with the criteria and things, but they fundamentally provide guidelines on like who gets access to the data, privacy requirements, like the clinical model that needs to be in place in it, and how to effectively integrate this into practice. So that guideline is a very good guideline as a checklist for things that need to be put into place. But I think fundamentally, the most important thing you need to understand is the EU AI Act. Now, the EU AI Act was implemented in August 2024. It became legislation then. And the reason why I say this is important is because like all other legislations are fundamentally going to be based on this AI regulatory ones. So the UK's one, South Africa's one, Australia's one, they all draw principles from the EU AI Act because it was the first act to be put into place. And if you design a system that's fundamentally addressing the requirements of the EU AI Act, then it will automatically apply in less restrictive kind of like jurisdictions, right? Because the EU AI Act basically fundamentally says that if you're going to measure something for educational purposes with affect their work or like their mental health related stuff, and it will automatically classify a system as a high risk orientated system. And because of that, it requires very explicit requirements in terms of documentation, monitoring, and transparency. So if you understand the EU AI Act and make sure that your stuff complies to it, you're golden. So I think we kind of like have to move this keynote now from like these big ideas and governance frameworks and things into product obligations, into ways in ways in which people can actually understand what you're talking about. And I think we can do this in six couple of ways. I think it's very important for us to translate it, to help translate our psychological science into very clear and defined claims and make very clear with regards to what the boundaries are of what we can actually endorse and say. And this should be clearly communicated to both marketing and product design teams. We have to make sure that we clearly document the underlying theory of change, the behavioral change model architecture, which we'll speak about later in more detail. We must make sure that's clearly articulated, and that's the foundation of everything and every product and every tool and feature that's being designed. And to ensure that everybody around the table understands that exact theory of change. Third, we must make sure that the stuff that we measure, both qualitatively and quantitatively, is valid and reliable, that it's transferable, that it's free from bias. Fourth, we have to make sure that we actively and passively monitor potential adverse effects of our interventions. And this includes looking at how people are interacting with the system. It should include adherence rates. It should include asking the users actual questions so that we can identify potential harm before it occurs so that we can intervene appropriately. And when harm occurs, number 5, that we have clear escalation pathways in place. If something occurs, we have a human on standby that we can route a person to for an appointment, right? And we have to ensure finally that just when we design the system doesn't mean that that system is going to be stable and how we plan it to be. We have to make sure that we consistently monitor the system over time to ensure that users are engaging it in a way in which we want it to and that it doesn't cause harm. So it's important to know that these governance frameworks and things, they exist. The tools are there. You just have to go and find them. and apply them. But the question I have for you, and the question you should pose to your design teams is, will you use them, or will you wait for regulators to make it compliance and not just governance, right? And as I said in a previous kind of like keynote, I think psychologists can play a massive role in this place, but only if they sit at the table where these things are being discussed, where they're developed and where they're designed. So what role can we play in this? So before I start, I think we should become co-designers of the system, right? And I want to say that I think psychology should be the infrastructure on which all platforms are built, and not just a post-launch garbage we put on to get credibility. And also, we are not compliance officers, right? We design the psychological safety architecture of the systems. And it's important to keep that in mind, because there's a difference. There's a difference between compliance and building for safety. And because I think when design teams treat psychology as a nice to have, right, or something that can implement ex post facto, they don't see the value of the things that you bring to the table. And also, they don't see how whatever it is that you bring to the table can convert into a product that adds real value, right? So I think you have to give them the translation, and that's your responsibility. So how do we practically do that? So your theory of change, your mental model on how to facilitate change in the behavior becomes the product design requirements. In other words, what the features that we're designing it for, what must it do, for whom does it work, and under what conditions, right? We should not just provide like vague ideas of, oh, this improves well-being or whatever through cognitive reframing. We should be very clear with regards to what it does, what we're targeting, and what the exact effect it's going to be, for whom, under what conditions, and how long it's going to take for us to get there. Second, the construct maps that we talk about, how a job demand, a job resource, a personal demand, all of this stuff affects well-being, like that construct map, that becomes the road, the telemetry specs, the things that we actually measure throughout our system. Because what the data represents, what they do, what they don't do, what we can use it for, what we can't use it for, and what uncertainty looks like, we have to clearly define these things up front, and these things need to be fit into our theoretical assessment kind of like framework or model. Otherwise, it does not serve a purpose, right? So we have to be very clear also when we communicate this to our design teams that, for example, if an instrument was designed to, measure personality, and they want to use that same instrument to estimate risk, can we predict a person's risk propensity? Maybe theoretically we can, but if the instrument wasn't specifically designed to assess risk, right, it cannot be used for that purpose. And we have to be very clear on that. Next, our validation plans become their evaluation roadmaps. So when they usually do pre-release kind of like testing with a small like group of users to kind of see if the thing works or not, right? We use that same requirement to say we do subgroup difference testing. We look at what works, what doesn't work, right? We have to make sure that we translate that into an evaluation framework that makes sense to us, so we can justify the decisions that we make about the effectiveness of the tools that we advising them or designing for them, right? We should also implement like post-launch, like what they call surveillance, root cause monitoring, in order to determine if the models that we have drift or if people actually deteriorate in their well-being. Because only then can we build systems that actually help people. And finally, it's important to know that like what we would consider like contradictions, right, translate into kind of like their routing and escalation kind of like protocols. Because when the features, for example, that we implement is designed, we have to dictate where it should be used, where it should stop, when it should actually, at what level should it start giving a signal and warn people that potential is harm, and at what level do we actually have to refer people out for professional care, right? So, and that's not just like saying, oh, if a user score is like 15 on the big depression index, that we have to like escalate them. That's important, right? Because we have to immediately route them wherever, but we also have to look at within the system to figure out ways in which we can like trigger or assess these potential triggers and route and escalate them to the right person before they actually before it actually gets worse. Finally, I think the idea about monitoring and their word kind of like surveillance terms harm from an like a anecdote into something that we can actually kind of like measure and signal. So we can actively detect deterioration, right, by looking at how a user engages with the system, and we don't necessarily have to wait for them to actually ask for it or to complain, like, or to show complaints. We can actively measure this, and by implementing these safeguards and things in place, right, it doesn't mean that we're stifling innovation, right? It's about preventing actual potential harm. And we have to be able to build a defensible system and products that can survive regulatory changes and reputational scrutiny. Because I think psychologists are far too often being brought onto the table at the end of the process to sprinkle on a little bit of science and to give some stamp of endorsement on a final product. That is too late, because we need to be sitting at the design table from day one in order to ensure that these things are developed in a reliable way. Because I think psychology is not a compliance checkbox. It's the psychological safety architecture that allows these digital mental health interventions to be implemented in a safe and secure way, and in a way that we can actually scale. So for us to become co-designers in these systems, we need to be able to bring an artifact to an engineering team that they can understand, that they can build from, and that they can audit. So what's the thing that we can actually bring to the table? Well, I think we can bring the behavioral system architecture, understanding the exact roadmap, how we get a person from being depressed to being healthy, right? That behavioral framework, both the empirical model, how to actually get there, and the behavioral change model that underpins it, right? So I think how I kind of like see this is like how I always position it. It's like a testable kind of like decision framework that specifies to the design team what can change, right? By what mechanisms can they change? Under what constraints and conditions can they change? And what evidence will count as progress towards change, right? So when I talk about what can change, think, for example, nobody can teach you to be happy. It's impossible. Nobody can. But I can teach you person-environment fit. I can help you to find the person that you are, figuring out where the role that you need to be in, and match that. Because person-environment fit leads to higher levels of happiness. Strengths use, if I am able to use my strengths in my actual life, it makes me happy. That I can help you with, but I cannot teach you happiness. So that I can change. By which mechanism? So again, what do I change? Maybe strengths use, maybe person-environment fit. That's the mechanism through which we can facilitate change. Under what constraints? You can't balance, even though all the research on Earth shows that running a mile a day is going to improve your health significantly. If I'm in a wheelchair, I can't run. Doesn't matter what the science says. So it's important that we design interventions within the physical, financial, social kind of constraints in which the person is in. And we have to define what do we use as evidence of a person actually changing towards or progressing towards a goal. Because I think this is the platform's design contract and the audit spine. It's the thing that we use to explain why interventions work, why they don't work, and how to ensure that we provide something that is actually measurable and that decisions can be audited. So what does this behavioral safety framework architecture kind of like do? It does four things. One, it helps us figure out the exact thing that we need to target, the exact outcome, and figures out the exact levers we need to pull to get there. For example, if we want to get to happiness, which is our target, it helps us with this specific person. It shows maybe, we can pull the person environment fit lever, or we can pull the job crafting lever, or we can pull the strength use lever, the thing that's most effective for them, right? Second, it provides us with a mechanism to understand the actual user's need, figuring out the mechanism to trigger, providing with the right intervention that works for them, and tracking the outcome. What do I mean by this? Is that sometimes a user says something, but they mean something else. I like to use the example of like going into the company and doing climate studies, right? In every company that I've ever done a climate study on, the first thing people say what's wrong is that, communication is a massive problem within this company. Now, if we take communication as the problem, I'll design a communications training thing for you, then implement it, and then evaluate it, right? 99% of the case, it doesn't work, because 99% of the case, actually 100% of the time, the case, communication is never a problem. So if you ask the person, what do you mean by communication? They say, oh, actually, my manager doesn't really listen to me, and my colleagues don't really support me in my work. Okay, that's not communication, sir. That's managerial relationships, peer support, colleague support. That versus communication, two totally different things. So it helps us to take what a user says and identify the actual underlying need under it. If we understand the actual need under it, we can implement the mechanism. We know maybe conflict management is the problem, or maybe influence and negotiating is the thing that's the problem there. So those mechanisms we can potentially target, create interventions around them, training, exercises, whatever, implement it, and we can evaluate the outcomes. We can track the effectiveness of it. So it helps us to explain the mechanisms that facilitate change. On the practical level, it also provides us, the psychologists and the design teams and everybody involved, with a shared language around interventions and behavioral change. Because if we all design around the same stuff and we use the same language, we are aligned. And it makes it easier for us to understand what to do, when to do it, and under what conditions, whether you're an engineer building the platform or whether you're the strategy team doing research on potential user needs. It provides us with the same language to work from. And finally, the whole idea around it defines what constitutes success and who is accountable, because it defines exactly what the success means. How does a person kind of like grow? What constitutes change? It provides the evidence needed for that. And it also assigns like who is accountable for these decisions. Which person, if something goes wrong, is the person that it needs to be escalated to in order to fix it. So these are the 4 functions that this plays. Why is this non-negotiable? One, because it prevents what I call feature theater. The idea that we're actually just creating a whole bunch of features, putting them into place and saying, oh, this actually facilitates change, right? But with no theoretical grounding under it. So we design very beautiful tools with no potential impact. Second, it helps us with true personalization, because if we have this behavioral model in place, we know exactly which lever to pull for which person under which conditions, which will have the most potential impact for them, right? So third, it reduces the potential harm and compliance risk because it clearly defines our boundaries. It makes all of the decisions that we make very auditable and has a clear pathway for us to be able to replicate in different scenarios, right? Because we're basing it on the same design principles. Four, it makes the impact that we have provable and measurable. So because we clearly define what counts as evidence, right? We define what change should look like and when it show up and at what time, we can clearly see if something is working or not. And finally, it accelerates scalable delivery because we can clearly and quickly build a product that's effective and efficient, implement it, see if it works for which group of people, change it under what conditions, and then start rolling it out to larger people in a lot faster kind of like way. So how do we do this in practice? Well, I have like 2 kind of like tools that I kind of like use to help me, and I want to share with you. So the first is like, I call it like the psychological product safety pre-flight checklist. This is kind of like a tool you can use and insist on being used without it becoming a bottleneck in the design process. So this checklist kind of like functions like as a pre-flight kind of like checklist, things that need to be in place before we can actually take off. It doesn't necessarily guarantee success, but it prevents us from engaging in known failures that we know from both research and practical experience. And it helps these failure modes from becoming repeated incidents. So let me kind of walk you through the 6 things that I've kind of like figured out over the past couple of years. The first one that I mentioned also before is that we have to exert extreme amount of discipline in terms of the claims that we make. Every claim that we make needs to be bound by exact evidence and it should be testable, right? We should be very clear about the limitations and should we communicate this in a very clear and effective way so that each user can understand it in their language. So not, for example, saying, oh, we can eliminate anxiety in totality. No, communicating something, oh, we have a tool that is shown to be effective in helping people reduce anxiety symptoms over the course of 6 weeks for these amount of kind of like people. So be very clear with regards to that. Second, always insist on the integrity of measurement. of the integrity of the mechanisms underpinning the interventions that we design, we should always have a theory of change, a behavioral change model in place, fundamental. Even if it's as simple as that cone model, like capacity, opportunity, motivation, and behavior, right? That small little model. Even if it's that simple, because it must specify, because this model must specify who the feature is for, how it's supposed to work, and what a non-response kind of like actually means. That is extremely important to protect those mechanisms. Similarly, we have to insist on effective measurement practices. If you measure a construct, you must be able to define and defend it. You have to show validity, you have to show reliability, and you should have to show evidence that is not biased for different subgroups. And you have to always test measurement invariance. See if the same thing is measured the same for different groups of people. And the same with the qualitative information. If you use LLMs, it's very important that you ensure that that model was trained on data that is representative of the people that you're actually measuring, in order for it to ensure that there's no bias and stuff in place. Third, user protection and user safety should be a fundamental key. You should, there will, of course, be kind of like issues and things that kind of like come into place. And a potential user will deteriorate because of your system, right? So it might potentially show that they show worse symptoms and stuff. But we should be able to assess this fundamentally and then escalate it where appropriate. So user safety should be put into place from the get-go, not just from a informed consent, data privacy, whatever. I mean, from a psychological perspective, and always ensure that you've got clear escalation pathways in place. Next, we have to have a clear evaluation plan. We have to be very clear with regards to what constitutes a benefit, a harm, and engagement, and how we're actually measuring it. And these things should not just be assumed, because the designers will assume that things are in place and they won't know what they don't know. So it's important for us to be very clear on defining what constitutes each one of these factors. And we should be very clear to pre-register our potential outcomes, not in terms of like the scientific open science sense. I mean, clear to say that a certain outcome will be achieved by a certain process in a certain amount of time. So we have to be very clear with that and make those assumptions very clear, because if people engage the system and they do not show, for example, a 5% reduction in stress over a 3-week period, it means either the intervention is wrong, the delivery is wrong, or there's something wrong with the person. So we have to be very clear with regards to that. And we have to also be very clear with regards to how we constitute an adverse event and how we measure it. Because defining it is important, because we base metrics around that concept. So we can only measure it if we're very clear with regards to what that thing is. Number 6, governance is the fundamental framework here. So that ties all of this stuff kind of like together, because we have to clearly define who takes ownership of which specific aspect. That old responsibility, accountability, kind of rocky kind of like matrix plays a fundamental role here, because it defines who's responsible where. We have to be very clear with what we log. We have to be very sure with what we measure and at what times we measure certain things. So, for example, you can't measure personality every single day because it doesn't change, but well-being could potentially. And we must make sure that we have certain release gates in place for when we kind of like a user meets a certain risk threshold. And I think if you have all of this stuff kind of like in place, you meet the majority of the requirements for the different pieces of legislation. So if you can't check all 6 of these boxes, right, you cannot ship a product. And that's a fundamental principle that you should keep as a value to you and that you should not deviate from. Because each one of these items protects against a known kind of like failure mode that we know from literature and practice that occurs. Because each one of these things has to become a design artifact that we should design for, and not a post hoc intervention or audited mechanism. The second tool that I want to talk about is kind of like, well, if this stuff doesn't work, you have to figure out a way in which to influence their decision-making process, right? Because I, for example, seen that when you raise these concerns, and the design team say, oh, that's a nice to have, that's extra work, it's not necessary, maybe we'll do it in version 2 or version 3 or later, right? The antidote to get them to listen to you is not screaming louder and being more moral and saying, oh, but this is the ethical violation or whatever. That's not going to change anything, right? In order to change things, you have to take the idea of like, approach it like in a structural way to influence it from the ground up. And here are a couple of strategies that I've seen work for me over the past couple of years. The first strategy is always speak their language. So speak in product risk terms. Don't say something is unethical because they won't care, right? Speak clearly about the risk this thing poses. This feature creates 15% deterioration risk for this group of people, and it will show up in this specific retention metric. And we will see negative reviews of this in 6 weeks. And what does that cause? It causes increased liability under the EU AI Act because it's what we're doing is a high risk thing. And this leads to X amount of fines. So describe the harm pathways. Be explicit about how it affects users and different user segments, and ensure that you explain what is being measured and what the potential outcome is. So always speak in risk. Second, bring your safety case to the table, right? Bring your evidence dossier, as they say. I always have like a 1-page evidence document that I always take with me for every new feature. One, with a couple of things on. One, what's the claim that we're making, right? Two, what is the evidence that supports that this claim, that this tool is actually going to work? Three, what limitations do we know of this, right? So what are the limitations of this intervention? Five, what harm can potentially be caused if this thing goes wrong? 6, how do we monitor things? So I put a monitor plan in place. And finally, how do we mitigate potential risk? So I try to make it as visual and as concrete as possible because that way they understand. Next, we have to define the decision-making and accountability rights. So across the entire product's lifecycle, from the beginning to when it is decommissioned, right? So discovery, build, launch, whatever, we have to define who is responsible for what feature, who is accountable, who is only consulted, and who is only performed, right? That level of responsibility should be there, not just from a compliance perspective, but so that you know who to contact when something potentially goes wrong. And psychologists must always be accountable for the theory of change, the validity plans, the safety monitoring protocols, and the logic, and the routing logic. If you are only consulted as a psychologist after something being shipped, your role is only symbolic in that matter. Fourth, so we have to kind of like run hard postmortems and red teams. So basically the idea is to say, go in and try to break the system, try to find things that is wrong because this user will use the system in a different way than what you intended it to do, right? And you have to explain it to people and kind of like role play ways in which to identify these potential risks if the system hasn't, for example, been up yet. So for example, speak to the dev team and say, oh, imagine this feature that we're just using is harming a user in 6 months from now. What happened? How did it occur? How did we not pick it up? And work backwards from there to try and identify the potential problems. Role play how users would potentially use the system in ways that it was not intended to be used. What breaks? What gets missed? What gets lost in translation? Be very clear here because that will help you identify what could potentially negatively affect your thing. The last strategy here is to say that you should always tie your work to some measurable form of risk reduction. So whenever you try to implement, show or discuss the potential impact, right? For example, this new routing logic that we want to implement reduces the amount of crises that we experience by around 40%, right? So, and that actually decreases our risk. It improves this thing. It decreases the amount of money that we pay. It decreases our token risk, whatever, right? So we have to be very clear with regards to what we want to do, how that actually how it actually positively affects the way in which we manage risk within the system, right? And only by taking these 5 things into consideration can we change psychology from being optional advice to clear governance infrastructure. So I want to say that even if you forget everything else today, there is a certain minimum standards that we have to push. Doesn't matter what our roles are, because psychological acts create psychological responsibility, and the intent, whether it's good or not, doesn't remove our duty of care and our responsibility for ensuring a safe product. With that in mind, I think there's 4 things that which should be non-negotiable for us in any system design. 1, we should make no claim about the psychological benefit around something if there's no physical, empirical evidence in place and if we don't know what the limitations of this are. 2, we will not deploy a service, or a platform without it being anchored in a known psychological framework or theory, known behavioral change theory, if we've got no mechanism in place to actually measure harm, and if we've got no routing mechanism in place to escalate it or refer harm when we've detected it. Third, we will engage in no level of personalization without evidence showing that that personalization is effective for different subgroups, right? And fourth, and this one is specifically for you, you will not provide guidance without being competent in AI. Because if you're not competent in the technology, you cannot advise appropriately, and that will fundamentally cause harm. So, I kind of like want to leave you with this question, right? Like, if a product that measures your mind without consent, what does that do? That is surveillance. A product that changes your mind and your way of doing things without having safeguards and stuff in place is malpractice. So if we build systems that assesses you, influences you, that says it can help you, right? We have a duty of care, and we have to take that responsibility onto us. Because by the end of the day, I want you to remember that your responsibility here is to ensure that we design safe, effective, and risk-free systems. And how do we do that? Through communicating risk, for ensuring that governance structures are in place, for ensuring that's evidence for all the claims that we make, to ensure that our users are protected, and finally, to ensure that everything that we do is rooted in the behavioral safety architecture. Thank you very much.